The hearing will come to order. Today, the Senate is holding a hearing in this committee on one of the most indefensible disparities in our system of justice, and the bipartisan legislation designed to eliminate it once and for all, the Equal Act. To start things off, I'd like to turn to a video about the history of this disparity and the racially disparate impact it's had.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
It is epidemic and it can kill.
We must be intolerant of drug use and drug sellers.
The crack problem has become a crack crisis and it's spreading nationwide.
We must be intolerant of drugs not because we want to punish drug users, but because we care about them and want to help them.
In 1996, I was sentenced to 35 years. This disparity caused my sentence to be increased for 20 years longer than it would have been had it been for powder cocaine.
In 1995, I was sentenced to 20 years. My 11-year-old daughter was molested while I was in prison at 11 years old.
My sister was barely 23 years old and a mother of 3 young children. If Eugenia had been sentenced for powder cocaine, her sentence would have been less than half of the one she received.
Why did we do that? Because we were frightened.
It was a reaction.
There was a misperception that crack cocaine was something different chemically than what powder cocaine was.
It's only a mere frying pan and baking soda that stands between powder and crack.
Congress created this disparity, which was 100 to 1 between crack and powder cocaine sentences.
President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act. It reduces the disparity in the amount of powder cocaine and crack cocaine required for a mandatory minimum sentence.
The U.S. Sentencing Commission agreed to make retroactive changes in sentencing guidelines.
Doesn't save lives, doesn't reduce crime. So what does it do? It protects the status quo, and the status quo is white privilege.
80% of crack defendants are African American, and they're 20% more likely to be sentenced.
It's mostly small-time dealers who end up in jail.
For every white crack dealer, there are 10 black crack dealers prosecuted.
We can't get rid of discrimination in every human heart, but we can take it out of the criminal code.
This is not a weak on crime initiative. You can still enhance their penalties. And so if it's violence associated with it, you're going to have tougher penalties, and that's what we have to concentrate our efforts on.
President Obama signed a law that will close the long disputed gap in federal sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine, cutting the ratio to about 18 to 1.
But that was a political compromise that no one thought finished the job.
In November 1985, the New York Times ran a front-page story warning of a, quote, new purified form of cocaine that had emerged on the streets of New York City. The article characterized the drug as the wave of the future and quoted a doctor who claimed that anyone who used it would be addicted almost instantaneously. Over the next year, thousands of articles and hours of breathless news coverage would be devoted to the dangers of crack cocaine. But much of this coverage was predicated on an outright falsehood, such as the notion that crack is more addictive than powder cocaine, or that it's more likely to make its users violent. Today, several decades removed from our mass panic over crack cocaine, we know that powder cocaine and crack are simply two forms of the same drug. Make no mistake, both are addictive and dangerous, and once they reach the brain, they produce similar physiological and psychological effects. But while the scientific consensus on crack has evolved over the years, our nation's drug sentencing policy has not. At the height of the crack scare in 1986, facts fell victim to fear, and fear inspired misguided and discriminatory policy. In response to a nation in panic, we passed, on a bipartisan basis, a law that imposed 100 to 1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine offenses, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. To this date, it is one of the worst votes I ever cast. That legislation derived from a war on drugs era mentality that we could somehow incarcerate our way out of a drug epidemic. That approach did not work with crack cocaine. In fact, it has never worked. In the 50 years since President Nixon declared our failed war on drugs, drug use and drug availability has increased. Our nation has endured a crack epidemic, a meth epidemic, and currently an opioid epidemic. By now, I hope we all understand that drug addiction is not a choice and just not a moral failing. It is a disease. Instead of meeting the public health crisis of addiction with care and compassion, we've met it with punishment and penalties. The results have been devastating. And when it comes to crack cocaine, we established a sentencing disparity that has directly fueled the crisis of mass incarceration in America. During the first 4 decades of the war on drugs, our federal prison population grew by 700%, and the cost of operating federal prisons exploded by 1,100%. Those bloated costs have diverted public safety resources away from where they're needed and have made us less safe. Today, our nation is home to just 4% of the world's population and about 20% of the world's prisoners. In America, we pride ourselves as the land of the free, but the sad fact is we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Worse yet, the crack powder disparity has exacerbated the systemic racial inequities in our criminal justice system. We must bring this injustice to an end, and we can begin by eliminating the crack powder disparity. I'm confident we can achieve this on a bipartisan basis. Over the years, I've worked with my Republican colleagues like Ranking Member Grassley and even former Attorney General Sessions to reduce the crack powder disparity. In 2009, I authored the Fair Sentencing Act. The bill I wrote would have fully eliminated the crack powder disparity. But to get it across the finish line, I agreed to a compromise version with then Senator Jeff Sessions that reduced the disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. It was a good step forward, but not enough. This lingering disparity means that a person arrested for 28 grams of crack, do we have that? I guess we don't have the illustration. I'll skip that. As I've said, I'm confident we can come together to finally resolve this injustice because there are other steps we have taken to address inequities in our criminal justice system on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis like the First Step Act. With that legislation, Republicans and Democrats, with President Trump, work together to improve conditions in our nation's prisons and shorten mandatory minimum sentences for non-violent drug offenses. We made Fair Sentencing Act retroactive, allowing thousands of people sentenced under the old 100 to 1 disparity to petition for early release, including Matthew Charles, who will speak to us today. Early evidence suggests that retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act has worked as intended. Last year, the Department of Justice reported that the recidivism rate for those released under the First Step Act was actually lower than historic recidivism rates. This much is clear. Our past efforts of reform have been bipartisan and they're working. The task that now lies before us is finishing the job we've started by eliminating this disparity altogether. It has no basis in science. It's done nothing to make us safer. It serves only to undermine trust in our system of justice, especially among Black Americans who are 6 times more likely to be imprisoned on drug charges than white Americans, even though the drug use is at a similar rate between them. What's more, legal experts and political leaders of all stripes agree Congress needs to finish this job. When I chaired a subcommittee hearing on this issue in 2009, the Department of Justice testified in support of completely eliminating the disparity. Today, 12 years later, the Department of Justice again is calling for Congress to eliminate it in written testimony. I welcome the Republican governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, who testified at our 2009 hearing, again with us today, calling for Congress to pass the Equal Act. Thank you, Governor. Before I hand things off to Ranking Member Grassley, I want to tell a story that is important and very personal. Ranking Member Grassley has been an invaluable and trusted partner in this effort. I know that he feels, as I do, that there are thousands of people who should be seeing justice in this country who are not because of these guidelines. One person I will never forget is a woman, Eugenia Jennings. She was originally from Alton, Illinois. As a child, she was abandoned and seriously abused. At the age of 15, she started using crack to dull the pain of her life. At 23, she was convicted for trading a small amount of crack for clothing for her kids. The federal judge, a personal friend of mine, Patrick Murphy, delivered her sentence and he said, quote, "This is not a sentence I'm happy with. I'm not proud of it. Congress is determined that the best way to handle people who are troublesome is just lock them up. So Eugenia Jennings, at the age of 23, was sentenced to 22 years in a federal prison for a nonviolent offense. She never gave up hope. While serving her time, she was a model prisoner who did everything asked of her. Years into her sentence, she developed a rare and serious form of cancer, leukemia. I'll never forget the day that I personally met her in the federal prison in Greenville, Illinois. I sat down with this lady and talked for over an hour. At the end of it, she said, "I don't know how much longer I'm going to live, Senator, but I promise you this. If you can find some way to get me out of this prison to be with my girls, I'll never do anything wrong again in my life." So I sat down and wrote a personal note to a former senator from Illinois named Barack Obama and asked him to commute Eugenia's sentence. He did. And just in time for Eugenia to see her eldest daughter graduate from high school. She died less than 2 years later at the age of 36. As we approach the end of the graduation season this month, I'd like us all to think about Eugenia. When she entered prison, her daughter was 6 years old. The next time she saw her in the outside world, her daughter was a young woman. Eugenia missed her daughter's first day of high school, her prom, and so many other rites of passage. And I want to salute her brother, Cedric Parker, who was on the video, the earlier video. He raised those kids while Eugenia was in prison. But Eugenia missed them because the mythology surrounding crack cocaine still dictates federal policy. Eugenia's gone, but there's still so many people like her counting us to finally eliminate this disparity. Let's not wait another day. Now I recognize Ranking Member Grassley for his opening statement.